So with that, let me go ahead and introduce Anand. So Anand Subramani is an experienced product manager with many years of experience here in Silicon Valley working for major companies like Zynga and Dropbox. In addition to being a practitioner, what makes him unique is that he's also a teacher of product management. He's been teaching a very popular course here at Stanford for about 4 or 5 years with his partner in crime, Jay-Z. And then in addition to that, they recently created an online self-paced program for the Stanford Center for Professional Development. That's available. You should see a little link there if you want to check out more about that, and we'll talk about it at the end as well. So with that, I'm actually going to just hand it over to Anand, and we'll get to your questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Pax. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're going to spend the next 30 to 40 minutes talking about one of the most common mistakes that I see in product management. And it's really under this theme of how to build what your customers want and what your customers need. So Pat shared a little bit about my background. I'll just share a couple more notes before we dive in. I've been working in product management in Silicon Valley for coming up on 15 years. I did my undergrad and my graduate degrees at Stanford, ended up as a product manager at Zynga, running product management for the Words with Friends franchise for a few years, moved to another startup called Dropbox, was there for almost 3 years running a business product, moved to another company called Gusto, another company called Pilot, and I've moved my way from a product manager to a VP of product over the past 10 years. So I both managed product management teams as an executive as well as been an individual contributor. And the reason that we're doing this webinar today is we want to take some of the common mistakes and common skills that we teach to our product managers that we hire and teach them to everyone. There's no magic in product management. It is a practicable skill and a teachable skill. So the goal of today is to help give you some information around the most common mistakes that we see in product management. So let me start off with what I think is a very common thing to see from someone in a product management discipline. You are talking to a customer, you're talking to someone in the audience, and you get a request. Someone comes up to you and says, hey, it would be really great if this existed. What if we did X? What if we did Y? Wouldn't it be cool if this thing existed? And you go and you do it. You spend 6 months or a year and hundreds of thousands or billions of dollars to develop something, and it doesn't work. And you push this product out to your audience. It has mixed results. It doesn't achieve the goals that you want, and you're sort of back to square one where you started. This is by far the most common mistake that we see in product management. And the reason that it doesn't work is it's getting some really important parts of the process backwards. And I'll explain some core concepts in a minute, but the fundamental mistake that's happening in a situation like this is when a customer comes to you and says, hey, wouldn't it be great if you could build this thing? You're delegating product management to your customer if you just build exactly what they want. And it's bad because you usually end up in one of few places. One possible place is you have a product that doesn't actually solve a problem for anyone. It solves a problem for someone, but people can't sustain the product. It's a second problem. But more often it mixes together a number of different problems and doesn't try and do anything in particular. So I mentioned this over and over, but this is by a very wide margin the most common mistake that we see in product management. I would say that more than half of the products that I've worked on in my career that ultimately were not successful had some form of this situation in their diagnosis. So today, what I'd love to do is introduce a framework that you can use to first notice when you're in the situation, and second, fix when you're in the situation. And to do that, I want to introduce the core concept for today, which is this notion of something called a problem space and something called a solution space. And these are two of the core concepts that we teach in our class at Stanford as well as the online class. But let me start off by defining the two of them and talking about the differences between them. Now we can talk about how you can use them to solve the problem that I just mentioned. Let's start off by defining the problem space. What do we mean when we say problem space? When we talk about a problem space in product management parlance, the problem space is the area where you are talking about the problem you are solving for the customer, who your customer is, and why it's important to them, and nothing else. There is no discussion of how you're going to solve the problem. You are entirely focused only on understanding your customer and the world and their problems today, and no energy is going into changing it at all. You're not proposing solutions, you're not doing wireframes, you're not drawing pictures, you are only listening. And this is a really difficult thing to do. It sort of runs counter to most people's intuitive notion. If you're having a conversation with a customer and the customer says, I had these problems, it's very natural to want to pitch them, well, what if we did this? What if we did this? Resist those urges and don't do it. The goal of the problem space is, again, only to understand things that matter to your customers and not to try and present any solutions to them at all. The best way to do this is with a set of skills that we call customer development or customer research. This is, again, its own separate and dedicated field. If you work in a larger organization, you'll often have dedicated researchers who can help you with this. It is a craft that can take many years to perfect, but it's another thing that we teach in both the online class and our class at Stanford. It's, again, a practicable skill. So if you interview dozens or hundreds of people, you will get better at doing this disambiguation almost for free. There's some of the common tips and tricks that we walk through. The real important principle here is you're not trying to convince your customer of anything. You're not trying to sell them something. You're not trying to pitch them something. Your only job is to listen. And again, that's a very hard skill to do well. I also want to disambiguate what we mean by problem. And when we say problem, what do we mean? Problem is just any unmet need, want, or desire from a customer. So it can be a problem that is, quote, real. It can be a problem that is experienced. All you're trying to do here is figure out an unmet need from a customer perspective. Okay, so let's do a quick recap just where we are and what we're talking about. So we introduced this really core concept of a problem space and a solution space. And one of the most common mistakes that I see in product management is mixing up these two things. It's talking to a customer, talking to somebody inside your company, and being unclear in your own mind whether you are trying to figure out what their problem is or whether you are trying to pitch them a solution. And the number one tip that we have for new product managers is to be very clear about which mode you are operating. Am I in a mode where my job is to understand customers and research what they care about? Or am I in a mode where my job is to pitch a solution or a product to customers? And again, when we say problem here, when we say solving a customer problem, there's a very broad definition of what we mean. A problem is just an unmet need, desire, or want from your customer. It doesn't need to be something that's life-changing. It can be something that is entertainment. It can be something that is small. But just in the vaguest sense, you're trying to solve an unmet need for a customer perspective. The other thing I want to mention that problems can very much be real or perceived. There have been a number of occasions throughout my career where a customer expresses a problem and it turns out there is actually a solution to that problem. They might just not be aware of it, or it might be an internal problem versus an external problem. So one of the other common mistakes you see in product management is telling your customers your problem is not real. If it is real to the customer, it is in fact a real problem. So the way this gets interpreted can sometimes be confusing. So if people are familiar with this quote, which may or may not have been said by Henry Ford, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. This is a quote that gets misunderstood, and I think it gets interpreted as don't listen to your customers. There's a little bit of a myth in Silicon Valley and in the press that your customers don't know what they want, and your job as a visionary or as a product leader is to ignore what your customers tell you and give them what they actually want. I think that's a fallacy, and I think the misunderstanding is actually just coming from a subtle misinterpretation of this quote. When a customer says faster horses, your job is to communicate that what they're looking for is to get between point A and point B in less time. And the skill of product management is to listen to your customers and interpret their words into a problem statement, because a customer isn't always capable of articulating exactly what they want. So definitely don't ignore your customers and make sure that you talk to your customers. But at the same time, you can't just delegate product management to them and do exactly what they say. Your job is to do interpretation between their words and their actual needs. So we introduced this notion of a problem space. Let me introduce the contradictory notion of a solution space. So problem space, again, you're only trying to understand the world of your customers, whether it's real or perceived. The solution space is what probably most people think of when they think classically of product management. This is where you try and change something. You build something, you prototype something, you design something. You're attempting to make an attempt to solve the customer's problem in the first place. So this is sort of the classic thing that people think of when they think of product management. wireframes, mocks, designs, that sort of work. But the key distinction again, and the point that we want to highlight today, is you shouldn't ever mix these two things. You should be very clear in your own mind whether you're operating in the problem space or operating in the solution space, and don't mix the two of them up. The solution space, very simply put, is how you're going to solve the problem for a customer. So a prerequisite for the solution space is understanding the problem space. This is, again, a very classic mistake that we see where someone will come up with the design and they will go and pitch it to a customer, and they won't have a clear articulation of what problem they're solving. So the design solves a little bit of a lot of different problems. It might solve 20% of problem 1 and 20% of problem 2. But when you really look at it from a customer perspective, there is no overarching synthesis of problems that it solves effectively, so the customer isn't interested in using it. I think a good problem space definition is basically always a prerequisite for getting to the solution space. So if you're working through this in real life, I would very much encourage you to start in the problem space before moving to the solution space. And this is the place where you very classically think of building something. So your job here is to build a real product or wireframe or a prototype. So we introduced a couple of key concepts so far. One is this notion of the problem space. The other is this notion of the solution space. But there are many other reasons that the product cannot work. It's totally possible to have a real problem from a customer perspective and a great solution and still have your product or your organization fail. So the second thing that we want to spend a few minutes talking about today is your job as a product manager is to figure out how you can actually capture value from something that you built. And the really simple way of distilling this is you can build something that your customers still love that solves a real problem for them and still fail. And I'll pick one example from recent history, but there are many more examples. I'm not sure if people in the audience are generally familiar with MoviePass, but MoviePass was a company that existed up until a few years ago that for $10 per month in the US would allow you to watch unlimited movies for free in theaters. And customers loved it. There were millions of subscribers that signed up in the first year. So from a customer need perspective, it was very clear that they were doing something that customers wanted. The problem for MoviePass came on the economic side of things. It turns out that when it costs $10 to see a single movie and you're selling unlimited movies for $10 a month, the economics make it very difficult to have a profitable company. So this is not to pick on MoviePass in particular, but the thing that I want to highlight is your job as a product manager is not only to figure out what your customers actually want, is to look at the intersection of customer needs and business opportunity. You'll sometimes hear this phrase, product managers are the CEO of the product, or product managers represent the business need. Your job is to bridge these two things and make sure that you are both doing something that your customers care about and something that is economically sustainable. And the key insight here is that if you go talk to a customer and you get a customer problem from them, that does not mean that that problem is always worth solving. It could mean that the market is too small for your goals. It can mean that they care about the problem, but they're not willing to pay for it. So there's a whole separate track that you need to think about as a product manager, independent of a customer problem, is there enough economic value here that this thing is worth solving? And I mentioned economic value. I think it's important both in the context of for-profit organizations, but also for the context of nonprofit organizations or NGOs, et cetera. You need to know what your goals are and figure out whether this thing is actually sustainable. So what's the difference between a problem and an opportunity? And this is just terminology that we teach new product managers when they join Jay-Z's organization or my organization. Very simply put, an opportunity is an idea that has been validated to be good for both the customer and for the company. So it means you've done homework on two sides of the problem. It means you've spent enough time talking to customers that you have a deep understanding of the problem space, and you've spent enough time on both the strategy and the economics that you're convinced that this is a good thing to build for the organization that you represent. So this, again, just a quick recap, the second very common way that products can fail is you do build something that customers want, but you're not able to capture enough economic value out of it for your company to be self-sustaining. So we teach a handful of different flavors for doing this, but what we wanted to introduce today was just very simply the core concept that your job as a product manager is to make sure you are at the intersection of things that are good for the user and good for the company, and to make sure you're not going too far in either way. You don't want to be too selfish from a company perspective or too altruistic where it's not sustainable. And again, not all problems can actually be solved in a way that necessarily captures value. Your job as a product manager is to figure out which is which. So it looks like we have a bunch of different questions from people in the audience. Pax, what's the best way to run through some of the Q&A together? Because I want to make sure we get through as many of these as we possibly can.
So we're getting a whole bunch of different kinds of questions and on. So I think maybe the place to start is coming back to how do you surface these problems to solve? So on the one hand, there's, you're an entrepreneur, you have a product idea, that seems fairly straightforward, maybe. On the other hand, if you're a product manager, you come into the middle of a cycle, how are you surfacing these problems? What are the best ways to do that?
Totally. I think it's dependent on two things. One of them is whether you have an existing product and existing customers. The second is whether you're starting something from scratch. So let me address each of those because you can get slightly different answers. If you join an existing organization or an existing product, some of the work that will already be done for you is hopefully you already have some idea of who your target customer is and what problem you are solving for them. So if that's the case, one of the very common ways that you build a roadmap for a product that already exists is to go spend time talking to either your existing customers or your next set of customers. So if I'll make up an example, if your current customer today is businesses with 0 to 50 employees and you want to target bigger businesses, maybe you would talk to businesses with 50 to 75 employees. So you have to fix something in this equation in order to figure out what you're doing. And the common things you can fix are you can either fix your customers or your market or your goals. If you're starting a new company, you have a very much chicken and egg problem. You don't have a customer yet, you don't have a product yet, you might have a goal and you need to figure out which of these things you want to fix. My suggestion for how to work through these is to fix the goal first and then the customer second, because the goals really matter. And by goals, I mean, what is your definition of success for your organization? So 2 examples. If your goal, for example, is to start a company that is worth $10 billion, there are many more constraints on things like the market size than there are if your goal is to start a company that's worth $1 million. And that will disqualify some ideas that might otherwise be good ideas. From a customer perspective, again, this is a bit chicken and egg, but my advice to people is to fix the customer and then to try and find a problem for them. So it's a little bit like fixing the market and then exploring that market to figure out where there might be an opportunity. This is not the only way to do this. You can sort of do it in the opposite direction as well. But to your question, you need to fix something in order to figure out who you can actually talk to determine whether something is a problem. And my advice for new companies or for new organizations is first think about your goals / the market and then think about your customers. And an existing organization, hopefully much of this work is done for you.
Great. And then we've gotten a few just in terms of the division of labor here. And so we'd be curious to know how you run it. I'm sure there are many different ways to do it. But if you're a product manager, should you be conducting these interviews yourself, or are you the person who develops the questions, the problem to solve, and then get someone else to conduct the interviews? What do you see in terms of the general division of labor in terms of these things? And I'm sure there are many models, so if you could talk through some different ways to approach that.
Yeah, it's very much dependent on how big your organization is, because as organizations get larger, they end up with specialization in different dedicated functions. So if you work at a very large company like Google, for example, you will have dedicated user researchers who might be the people who talk to customers. You will have designated product marketers who do a different slice of the product management work. So at very large organizations, there tends to be more specialization and a subdivision of labor between these problems. If you're working in an organization of, call it less than 100 or 200 people, then probably the product manager is the person doing all of this. And your job is both to talk to customers and synthesize the research and to write the report and to do the economic analysis. So it's very much dependent on size of organization. The way that I prefer to segment it in my organizations is to try and have as much information with one person as possible. So the problem with specialization is if it takes 15 people to figure out what somebody wants, you can end up with either design by committee or one person knowing a set of things and somebody else not liking a different set of things. So I think it's very important to have as much information in one person's brain as possible. So I prefer to keep the team smaller rather than larger.
That's great. And as you surface, so if you're starting, you've got a problem to solve, you begin to interview customers. How do you kind of validate the solution space? I mean, there's the risk of, say, a biased group of customers. Maybe you've only interviewed 10 to 15, and there is always the risk that they're, an unusual selection. So how do you validate the solutions you're coming up with? How do you mix qualitative and quantitative research to do that?
Yeah, really good question. So I would definitely say that there is no bulletproof way of doing this. The bulletproof way of doing this is to build something and try and ship it to the world, but that is expensive. So the whole idea of methodologies like an agile methodology or lean startup methodology is to take the scientific method and to try and apply them to different parts of this problem. So one way that we do this at my organization is to break down your solution into a set of things that you need to believe in order for your solution to be successful. So an example of this might be, we believe that the market is a certain size, or we believe that this set of customers actually really has this need, or we believe that people are willing to pay $500 for this product, and to try and prove small slices of those things individually. So let's just pick willingness to pay as a random example. If your thesis is, are people willing to pay for this, you have to do some infrastructure work with the ability to accept payments, et cetera, and then you can put it out there and see if people are actually willing to pay for it. So my suggestion is, there is not a surefire way to do this. Otherwise, everybody's product would always be successful. But it's to write down the list of hypotheses that you think need to be true in order for your thing to work, and to try and construct clever ways to test them in isolation from each other, in particular ways that are cheaper than building the whole thing. And what you're trying to avoid is spending many years or many millions of dollars up front researching something and then having it just not work.
That's fantastic. That's good good feedback. Hard to do, I imagine, in practice. Kind of staying within this problem solution space, we're getting a lot of questions about other sort of product management, and I do want to move to those at some point.
Okay.
But could you tease out a little bit more? I think this is always a challenge. Is teasing out the customer's want from their need. So there is, as you said, it's pretty straightforward when a customer says, hey, I think this is what you should be doing, and that's clearly what the customer wants. But in other cases, it could be a little bit more ambiguous and difficult. So what are some techniques for really teasing out the need or the real problem underneath the sort of language of the user?
Totally. One of the suggestions I have is to search for places that are either wasting time, money, or like human effort. And there's not a complete set of solutions, but those are three of the most classically common things that you can improve from a product perspective. So an example might be if somebody comes to you and says, I have no problems, and you'd be surprised how often this happens. You'd say, great, where are you spending your time? I just want to watch a day in the life. In your 8-hour day, when you go to work, what do you do? And what you might find out is actually they spend 6 hours entering stuff into Excel, and they don't consider that a waste of time, but there might be an opportunity for a product there. The advice I gave is very focused on products that are either targeted at businesses or products that are targeted sort of efficiency, save money, save time sort of things. It's a little bit harder to do in things that are consumer-oriented or entertainment-oriented. So when I worked in gaming, for example, the way we would do this is we would actually create like fake posters or fake trailers for games that didn't exist yet and see whether people are excited or interested in it. But I think the goal of the problem space, solution space disambiguation is to make sure that you are intellectually honest about which of the two you are in and know whether you're trying to learn something from customers or pitch something to customers at this moment in time, and never to mix those two things up.
And do you come back when you have a solution? Do you come back and do you pitch? I mean, how do you, or do you just launch the project?
Yeah.
I mean, what is
yes,
what is that?
Yes,
is it just
absolutely.
launching it, not pitching it?
No, absolutely you should go back. And this is dependent on what your constraints are. What is your timeline, for example? What is your budget? What is your company culture? There are companies that do none of this. Like Apple, for example, doesn't really test any of their hardware in large public areas. There are companies that run betas for 10 years at a time. So it's a little bit dependent on your company philosophy. But my suggestion for this is it is better as much as possible to take it back to your customers and see, does this actually work? And that's the reason that betas are so common, or alphas are so common, or early access is so common. So I think the general best practice here is not to just launch something and hope it works. It's you listen to some set of customers, build something, take it back to those people and see whether it's actually useful, and then launch it.
And so in those cases, to see if it's actually useful, you would want to set up a certain set of sort of metrics that you're looking at, or would you come back to the focus group and interview, or is it a combination?
It's usually a combination of both qualitative and quantitative, and part of this depends on how big you can go in your beta period. So in some of the betas that I've run, the beta might have 10,000 people, for example. And if the beta has 10,000 people, you can actually do quantitative measurement. You can say how often are people using this, how much time are they spending on it, et cetera. But if you're selling, let's say, an enterprise product where the total number of customers you have is 50 customers, it might be your ability to run really good analytics on a beta group of 5 might be much more limited. So again, it's a little bit of the tools that you have available based on your customer and your market. But I would try and pair as much qualitative and quantitative as you possibly can, because doing so will decrease your probability of failure.
That's great. I want to maybe shift, if you're comfortable with this, shift direction a little bit. So kind of thinking about the next stage, I know one of my biggest challenges, and it's coming up a lot, is prioritizing. As you get solutions in, and maybe you have a number of problems, and I know you point to, you can source it from complaints, et cetera. So I wonder if you could talk about 2 related things. So maybe first thinking about how you begin to prioritize some of the solutions that you're coming up with. And then the second, which I think is related, is giving us a sense of how do you estimate risk in terms of pursuing a different, I know you've talked a lot about that, and I think that's a really valuable topic to discuss in the context of prioritization.
Sure. So let me start with the prioritization question, and then we can talk about the estimation question. From a prioritization perspective, you must have some set of objectives that you are trying to achieve in order to do prioritization. And again, the most common place where I see people fall down is they have not agreed on what their objective, but what outcome they're looking for. So in an organization, you might call this company goals, you might call it vision, you might call it strategy, but you must have pre-agreed on the set of things that matter. Otherwise, it is impossible to do prioritization. Like you cannot compare disparate sets of things without knowing which goal is important. So at the organization that I run, for example, what we will do on either a 3-month cadence or a 6-month cadence is we will sit down with the executive team of the company and we will agree on the goals that matter. And these might be very quantitative. A particular example might be, we want revenue to go from A to B, or we want retention to go from B to C, or they could be qualitative. We want amazing customer feedback on something that we launch, et cetera. But this is a little bit of you just have to agree on it. And there is no right way to do this. Like determining whether revenue is more important than retention is very much a function of your company, your lifespan, the market you're in, whether you're venture funded, et cetera. And this is the reason that being an executive is hard. So you have to agree on the set of goals in the first place. Once you agree on the set of goals, now you have criteria to do prioritization against. And the goals give the ability to say, is it more important to do something that's revenue moving or something that is customer satisfaction moving? Well, we have pre-committed that we care more about revenue for this quarter than we care about the other problem. Therefore, this thing is important. So I think one really important piece here is you must know what your goals are before you can do prioritization. Otherwise, we'll talk in circles forever. And then the second one is to try and take your projects and to group them into buckets instead of comparing every project to every other project. So another thing that I see that ends up taking up a lot of organizational time is if your idea of prioritization is to take every possible project you could work on, put them in a giant spreadsheet, and compare it to every other possible project. And the problem here is the combinatorics on this is very large. And if you have 50 or 100 ideas, it is an impossible thing to reason about. So my suggestion for creating cognitive simplicity here is basically to create this notion of themes or buckets where you take projects that work on similar topics and group them together. And you prioritize first at a bucket level and then at a project level. So from a bucket level, you might say, the bucket of projects talking about customer satisfaction is more important than the bucket of projects talking about revenue, even if an individual project might be higher ROI than something in the other bucket. And then you can talk about, well, within that bucket, these are the most important projects. And what this does is it creates cognitive simplicity and organizational clarity. And especially as organizations get larger, one of the most dangerous things is people being confused about what actually matters. So a big part of your job as a product manager is to say, these are the things that matter, move in this direction. So that's very much my suggestion on the prioritization side. And probably the most common one is having an unclear set of goals that you actually care about, causing confusion in the organization. For your second question about estimation, I think there's a couple of different tools that I use in estimation for my prioritization. There's a very large number of prioritization frameworks. I wouldn't say that any is better or more correct than any of the others. But the two that I use are some notion of estimating impact and some notion of estimating cost. And they're not perfect, but from an impact perspective, some of the tools we use are a tool called Fermi estimation. We're basically doing back the envelope math to say, I think that if these set of assumptions held true, the impact to our goals might be X. So it might be we could get 700 customers sign up for this, each paying $100 a month. Therefore, revenue would go on. On the cost side of things, this is where you partner more strongly with your collaborators in an engineering team or a design team, and saying, we have some rough idea of what this thing looks like. How much do we think this will cost to build? And cost usually is expressed in time. Sometimes it's expressed in dollars. Depends on the field they're working in. But one of my pieces of advice here is being very aware of over precision. Like, it's very difficult to tell the difference between a project that might take 6 weeks and 7 weeks, for example. But I can probably tell the difference between a project that takes 6 weeks and a year. So the framework that I use for most of my project is hours, days, weeks, months, quarters, years, and only placing it in one of those buckets. Because otherwise you can spend a lot of time trying to figure out, is it 6 months or 7 months? And your ability to predict that perfectly in advance is probably not very good. The important thing to know is that it's 6 months, not a year.
Great. I think maybe it would be useful now to zoom out a little bit. We're getting a lot of questions, about sort of implementing some of these ideas at the organizational level. So, a lot of us will be working in organizations that don't necessarily have clear objectives, or where many managers are very much focused on solutions and not the problem space. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, obviously that's probably a bigger problem than a product manager can change, but how would you work within that to begin affecting organizational change? And maybe how would you apply these? I know you talk about this framework is not just something for creating products, but for solving problems in general. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you might even apply this framework to thinking about implementing some of these things at an organizational level.
Sure.
That was a complicated question. So it just the larger question is how do you work within an organization that does not have clear objectives, or where some of these principles are not, it's harder to follow within them. How do you navigate that as a product manager?
Totally. So one suggestion I have, if you are a line product manager or running a small team and you don't have the ability to get clarity for the entire organization, is to at least get clarity for the world that you are familiar with. So maybe it's going to your boss or the general manager of your division or your VP or whatever and saying, we may not know the 5 things that matter for the company, but can we at least figure out the thing that matters for my team? So ideally, you would create organizational clarity for the entire company and cascade it down to all of the teams. But if that's beyond your control, your job as a product manager is to make your team successful. So at the very least, one of the things I would do is try and get to clarity for your team, whether it's your immediate team or your group or your division or whatever, and just pre-committing to it. And one of the things that I've found in my experience working on this problem is that usually people aren't unwilling to give clarity here. They may either just not have thought about it, or the organization may not have these processes that exist to push it very clearly to everybody. So I can't think of an example, at least in my career, where I asked for clarity on what matters, and we were like, why are you asking this question? But you may not get the answer for everyone. You might just get the answer for your subdivision of the company. So I know that's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but you can't control everything as a product manager. And I would try and control as much as you possibly can to give your organization clarity. But if it's not all of the organization, so be it.
Fair enough. That makes sense. We're getting a few questions now. It might pushing into thinking about product management in other respects. So is this a framework that you've seen applied successfully to consulting or services industries, in addition to something where you have a clearly defined technology product or hardware product?
It depends a little bit on, so limited answer, yes. Broader answer is it's more complicated. I've done some work in consulting, and for example, and one of the things that at least I found to be true in consulting is there were 2 types of it. Type 1 of consulting was, the client genuinely did not know the answer, and they wanted you to come up with the answer for them. And in a scenario like that, I found frameworks like this to be very effective. The second type of consulting is the customer knows the answer and they want you to tell them what they already know because it creates organizational alignment or clarity or whatever. In a scenario like that, a process like this may be less useful. So I don't think this is this is not a framework that will solve all of your problems for all industries, for every company in the world. But I do think it's a pretty good way of thinking about problem solving in general. So whenever you need to solve some problem for somebody that isn't you, what it does is it forces you to go through this methodology of first talking to that person. You'd be surprised how many companies never even go through the effort of talking to the person they're trying to solve the problem for. Sitting and like writing on a piece of paper what you think the problems are and what you think success looks like, and only then starting to figure out what you want to do to solve that problem. So I do think it's a pretty generally applicable problem-solving framework, but it will not be, I mean, this is not the thing to use for every company in the world by any means.
And how have you seen this, how have you seen in the last 9 months through the series of shelter in places and other disruptions related to COVID-19, how have you seen the product management role change? And how do you predict it will, are any of those changes permanent? What is the future of that role?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think one thing that's gotten easier is actually talking to customers. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but in a prior world where you might fly somewhere to do customer research or set something up, things like Zoom or webinars are a little bit more normalized, and it's easier to go to customers wherever they are. So I've actually seen it get easier to talk to customers instead of harder to talk to customers, because what previously might be a trip to LA is now a Zoom that only takes 30 minutes. I've seen it get harder for product managers to do, to navigate internal organizational dynamics, because for better or for worse, I think product management often requires a lot of soft skills, and soft skills are very hard to do over the internet. It's a job that requires being able to go to someone, tap them on the shoulder and ask them a question, or have a hallway conversation, or have a set of in-person meetings. So I think the product management job as a creator of alignment inside an organization has gotten a little bit tougher as organizational unity fragments a little bit. But the silver lining is that customers are more willing to talk to you than ever, because many more people are willing to hop on a 30-minute video call.
That's great. That's incredibly helpful. One more question before we maybe talk a little bit about breaking into it. I'd love to spend maybe a few minutes on that, and then we'll end. I see a lot of questions have come in, and we appreciate the participation. But just for sake of time, we'll just get a few more. So one question is, for those on the call who maybe aren't product managers, but are in other positions and are trying to understand the product manager role, is there anything they should understand about the position or collaborating with product managers? So for instance, the sales team or the engineering team.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I have tried with a fair amount of success is just introducing this terminology of like problem space and solution space to 3 teams in particular. One team is like the sales and marketing team. The second is like a customer success or customer support team, and the third is an engineering team. And the reason that has been quite successful is those are the people who spend a lot of time either talking to customers or talking to you directly, and they have a tendency to only push through information in the solution space. So a really classic example of this dynamic might be, sales team is talking to a bunch of customers, and the customer's like, I won't buy because you're missing this feature. So in the old world, the salesperson write down, we need this feature, and then hand it to the product management team, and you'd say, well, like, what problem are we solving? And the answer to that. So having the sales team, for example, know to ask, oh, why do you need this feature? Like, what problem are you trying to solve, or what are you trying to do with it? Makes that conversation very different. Instead of writing down build feature X, what the sales team writes down is, this thing needs, their problem is they're spending too much time on this, or this is too hard to use, or whatever else. And that's a very different conversation to have, and a much more useful conversation to have. So you're not trying to teach everybody in the organization to be a professional product manager, but for people who spend a lot of time talking to customers, I have found introducing them to this distinction very helpful, because it helps them ask better questions to customers so that they can better surface to the organization what actually matters.
That's fantastic. So you're using that front line to be kind of the needs finders. They're conducting these mini interviews constantly, and you're getting much richer information as a result.
Yeah.
What about teams like
a company gets closer?
Sorry, go on. Yeah.
I was saying, as a company, the chance of being successful as a company goes up as you get closer to your customers. So it's not just your job as a product manager to be close to customers, it's everybody's job. So the better tools you can equip your entire organization with to figure out where customers actually care about, the higher chance of success.
So the natural follow-up is for those teams that may not be as customer-facing, for instance, maybe engineering or even content development. How do you translate, or how do you get them engaged into the customer mindset?
Yeah, so I'll just pick engineering as an example. One of the things that I found to be very helpful is if your job is if you think your job as a product manager is to show up and tell people what to build, it will only work so long as you are right, and no one is right all of the time. So you can very quickly suffer this, a crisis of faith, or the engineering team not believing you. But what tends to work much better is to explain why you are doing something, not just what you are doing. So one of the things that I do for all the projects in my product organization, for example, is we will basically have a meeting that exists between the product team and the engineering team that's working on something. We will sit down and we will walk them through the problem we're solving. It doesn't take long. It's half an hour and maybe a 6-week project, an 8-week project. So it's not a huge time commitment. But what it does is it solves two problems. First is they understand why. It's not just what we're doing. They understand why we're doing it. And the second thing that it does is it helps them ask better questions. So if you let's say you make a mistake, halfway through a project, and you're like, I think we should build this. And the engineer is like, oh, actually, I thought this was the problem we were solving. Well, how does this directly relate to that problem? You can say, oh, that's my mistake. I was not thinking it through. I forgot what problem we were solving. So I found that concept to be extraordinarily useful because it takes them along the journey that you have experienced, and it communicates not just what you are doing, but why you are doing it. And the more people that know why you are doing something, the more intellectual horsepower you can bring to bear on the problem, instead of people just doing whatever you put in a Jira.
That's great. That's fantastic advice. I think we're just about at time, but maybe the last question. I do want to mention again that there's a link in the interface where you can check out an earlier webinar where Anand goes in great detail about breaking into product management. But I think as we bring this to a close, do you have any thoughts, or what are one or two things that anyone who's in a different line within an organization might want to think about starting to do if they're interested in transitioning into a product management role?
Sure. The unfortunate state of the world today is that the best predictor of getting a product management job is already having a product management job, and a lot of people find it very hard to make the switch. I think that there are basically I've seen sort of 3 ways that people end up in product management careers. They're not responsible for 100% of people, but probably responsible for 70 or 80% of the people that I know. Track 1 is going through a structured program that exists in an organization. So, the famous ones are like the APM program at Google or the RPM program at Facebook. This is not a Silicon Valley specific problem, though. There are a lot of organizations that have a designated internal track. It's often 2 years, where you hire somebody out of school or out of an MBA program, and you spend a couple of years teaching them to be product managers. I very much believe it's a teachable skill, and I think that most of those are pretty high quality. So if you can end up in one of those, I think that's a great opportunity to do so. The second is a little bit of a backwards path, where you start an organization or you start a company, you get acquired, or your company is successful, whatever, and then you end up at some other company as a product manager. It sounds like a weird path to get there, but probably more than a third of the people I know who are product managers either previously founded a company that was acquired or founded a company, and there's a reason there's a lot of overlap between the founder skills and the product manager skills. And then the third is to be in a position where your job is to talk to customers on a day-to-day basis. So if you think of the 2 fundamental attributes that I think product managers should have, one of them is basically, can you be close to the customer? And second is, can you be good at the craft of product management? And if you don't have the second, I would think about how you can get the first. So teams like sales or success or support are particularly good at this because you spend all day talking to customers or prospective customers. So my advice to people if they're looking to make a career change is basically trying to figure out, is there a world where you can be as close as possible to your customers and understand them as deeply as possible? Because that's one of the core jobs of a product manager.
Perfect. I think that's a perfect ending point for the webinar. So Anand, I want to thank you for your time and thank everyone who joined us today. So Anand, thank you again for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us.